Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this video, that is based on an academic conference paper I presented at the third annual conference organized by the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Indonesia in November 2020, I will talk to you about the concept of Sunnah in progressive Islam. Before I start, it is important for me to emphasize that what I'm going to present is based upon more than 10 years of academic research and publishing on the topic that is presented to you on this slide. As you can see, my first publication on the topic of the nature and the concept of Sunnah goes back to 2007, and the most recent one is actually not listed here. Oh yes, it is, in 2020. So I have published a number of articles, chapters, and edited a book on the concept of Sunnah, which is still the most comprehensive study of the issue of the nature of the concept of Sunnah in formative, classical, and modern contexts. So what is my main aim? Essentially, I would like to explain to you how the concept of Sunnah is conceptualized in progressive Islam or progressive Muslim thought, and then also point to certain ethico-religious implications this concept of Sunnah would have on the ethical, moral, and socio-political and cultural lives of Muslims worldwide. So my paper is structured in the following manner. I will introduce the lecture by talking about the importance and the centrality of the concept of Sunnah in the Islamic interpretative tradition, and how it has always been contested by various groups and individuals and approaches. I will then continue. This will be followed by a very broad discussion of the main architects of progressive Islam, and I will situate this contemporary Islamic intellectual tradition in relation to the Islamic interpretative tradition, and specifically the manhaj, or the interpretative framework that is associated with progressive Islam. Then I will provide a brief overview of the concept of Sunnah in classical and formative periods of Islamic thought, to the extent that I will not comprehensively deal with these issues, and I refer my audience to the publications that I have listed here, especially this publication and that publication, that provide more detail, and of course the book on the question of the formative and the classical periods. My main aim is to actually explain the concept of Sunnah and progressive Muslim thought in relation to the continuities and discontinuities this approach has in relation to the formative period and the classical period. And finally, I will look at some of the ethico-religious implications this concept of Sunnah and progressive Islam has, primarily in relation to Islamic ethics and jurisprudence. And I will offer a brief conclusion. Okay, so the concept of Sunnah as one of the two normative fountainheads of the Islamic tradition is of fundamental importance in understanding nearly all branches of Islamic knowledge, but particularly so in the realm of Islamic jurisprudence and ethics, as we will see later on. Moreover, the concept of Sunnah, like other major concepts in the Islamic intellectual tradition, is a highly contested concept that has been conceptualized and interpreted differently by different schools of thought. And I have explained this in quite a bit of detail in my first book and monograph published back in 2011 in the book called Constructing a Religiously Ideal Believer and Muslim Woman, Neo-Traditional Salafi and Progressive Muslims' Methods of Interpretation. So therefore, it should not be surprising that the meaning and the nature of the concept of Sunnah has been appropriated throughout Muslim history by various religious and/or political actors. Hence, certain groups and actors were able to monopolize some of these concepts and came to be regarded, or indeed simply to regard themselves, as the most faithful, if not the only legitimate interpreters. The main aim of this paper is to present a discussion on how the concept of Sunnah, its sources, nature and scope, is understood in progressive Muslim thought, and what some of the implications of such an understanding of the concept of Sunnah are in relation to Islamic ethics and religious practices that have been and continue to be associated with this concept in mainstream Islamic discourses. However, before this is attempted, a brief overview of progressive Muslim thought is in order. Progressive Islam has emerged over the last 2 decades as one of the most creative and significant Islamic intellectual movements with a transnational following. If we restrict ourselves just to the 20th and 21st century, we can delineate and identify some of the major scholarly authorities that are associated with this approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition. That is not to say that we don't have antecedents of progressive Muslims' approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition prior to this period. Indeed we do, and I have explained this in my first book on progressive Islam, published 10 years ago nearly, that situates progressive Islam in relation to the entire Islamic intellectual tradition from its very beginnings. So in its most recent intellectual forerunners in the 20th century, for example, are modernist Muslim scholars such as Alal al-Fasi, Ibn Ashur, Ali Shariati, and Fazlur Rahman, Nur Kolish Majid, and others. In the 21st century, we can associate a number of additional Muslim academics and scholars who would come under the umbrella of progressive Muslim thought as I theorize it in my work. These include scholars such as Hassan Hanafi, Nasser Abu Zaid from Egypt, Al-Jabari and Asma al-Amrabet in Morocco, Abdul Karim Soroush, Ziba al-Husseini, Mahsen Kadivar from Iran, Farish Noor and Farid Al-Attas from Malaysia and Singapore. As I said, Nur Kolish Majid, late Nur Kolish Majid, and Faqih Hudain Abdul Qadir from Indonesia, Ali Ashgar Engineer from India, Muhammad Khalid Masood from Pakistan, Professor Anas Karic from Bosnia, and additional number of scholars from all over the world. What is important for me to emphasize at this stage is that many of these scholars are academics, but also have, in certain instances, also have studied in religious seminaries, traditional Muslim seminaries, come from both Sunni and Shia backgrounds, and a significant number of them are of the female gender. In broadest terms, progressive Muslim thought is one of the contemporary Islamic orientations that is premised on a particular approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition in the context of late modernity, whose delineating features are based on the following commitments or features that are listed on the slide. Creative, critical, and innovative thought based on epistemological openness and methodological fluidity, something called Islamic liberation theology, commitment to social and gender justice, a human rights-based approach to the Islamic tradition, process, rationalist and contextualist approaches to Islamic theology and ethics, and affirmation of religious pluralism. As I said, this comes from my 2 monographs of theorizing or progressive Muslim thought. Now, I have put the second last one in bold because it is this aspect of progressive Muslim thought that I will talk about most, and it has the most direct and significant implications when it comes to understanding the concept of Sunnah and progressive Muslim thought. So these delineating features of progressive Islam, all of them have a direct bearing on how progressive Muslims approach the concept of Sunnah. The architects of progressive Muslim thought represent but one approach to the contemporary discussion on the concept of Sunnah and Hadith, or Hadith reform, if you like. In the contemporary Islamic discourses, in my view, we can delineate 5 distinct approaches to the concept of Sunnah. And I'm presenting them on this slide. So there is the mainstream Sunnism approach associated with such scholars that I have provided on the slide. Non-mainstream Sunnism, and the Sunnah Hadith conceptual distinction. And this approach is often associated either with progressive Islam or in some cases with mainstream Sunnism, or it's an offshoot in a way. The Qur'an only approach, and finally the progressive Islam approach. As I said, these are merely heuristic categories and are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and there are certain overlaps nonetheless. There is conceptual value in my perspective in providing this typology, if you like, for conceptual clarity. So consonant with the aims of this paper, I focus on how progressive Muslim thought approaches the concept of Sunnah, with specific reference how the nature and the scope of this concept is understood, and what some of its implications are for considering Sunnah as a normative source of Islamic ethics for Muslims worldwide. However, before this is discussed, more needs to be said about the meaning of the concept of Sunnah and how it evolved over time in the Islamic interpretative tradition. Now, a detailed discussion of this issue is beyond the scope of this paper, and I have already pointed you to some of my previous publications on this matter, especially my 2012 and 29 articles in Arab Law Quarterly, as well as my edited volume on the concept of Sunnah published in 2015. So what is needed, therefore, is a brief overview of the most important and relevant findings of the concept of Sunnah, how it was understood in formative and classical Islam, before I can explain how progressive Muslims approach this concept. So, during the first 3 centuries of the Islamic era, the concept of Sunnah seems to have been primarily understood as a general, unsystematically defined ethical-behavioral practice of the early Muslim community that had been formulated, preserved, and transmitted either orally and or through the practices of the Prophet's companions. Ghuraya, who investigated the concept of Sunnah in the early Maliki school of thought, for example, has argued that during this very early period, Sunnah was a concept based on recognized Islamic religious norms and accepted standards of conduct derived from the religious and ethical principles introduced by the Prophet. However, for a variety of different reasons, already Before the end of the 1st century of the Islamic calendar, Muslims began to systematically document the events surrounding Prophet Muhammad's life in the form of short written reports that were termed akhbar or hadith. And over the next 2 to 3 centuries, this phenomenon, known as talabul ilm, had given rise to the formulation and consolidation of what became known as the hadith sciences, the ulum al-hadith, which included branches of knowledge pertaining to the collection, assessment, and evaluation of hadith based upon certain methodological principles and mechanisms designed to ensure their authenticity. This was done with a view of using the hadith deemed authentic, in addition to that of the Qur'an and other sources of Islamic ethics and law, as important sources of Islamic jurisprudence, ethics, and to a lesser extent theology. With the process of development and maturation of mainstream Islamic legal theory at the end of the 5th century Hijri, the concept of Sunnah was for hermeneutical, epistemological, and methodological purposes largely conflated with that of the so-called authentic or sahih hadith as defined by hadith specialists, the muhaddithun, and was recognized as a form of unrecited revelation. Because of its voluminous nature and because of the Qur'an's limited capacity to be used as a comprehensive source of Islamic laws and ethics, this, what I call hadith-dependent concept of Sunnah, became a very significant, if not the most significant, source of Islamic norms, values, laws, practices, and to a lesser extent, beliefs. Moreover, seen from the perspective of mainstream Islamic legal theory, this concept of Sunnah was not only functioning as a source that could confirm various Quranic injunctions, but also specify, restrict, supplement, or even override them. Importantly, this concept of Sunnah also encompassed certain theological beliefs in mainstream Sunni Islam. So it was not just restricted to norms, values, and practices, but also included certain theological beliefs, such as second coming of Jesus, or Dajjal, or punishment in the grave. This mainstream classical Islamic legal theory approach to concept of Sunnah, however, in many ways significantly departed from the nature and the scope of the concept of Sunnah as it was understood during the formative period of Islamic thought. For example, in terms of the sources of Sunnah, during the formative period of Islamic thought, the concept of Sunnah was not restricted to the persona of Prophet Muhammad only, but included other significant religious authorities such as the first 4 caliphs as independent sources of Sunnah, or even entire Muslim believing communities. This concept of Sunnah found expression in a number of different ways that are given to you on this slide. Such as a Sunnah as a well-established general normative practice, amal, that is perpetuated in aktu, in other words, in actions, bodily actions, something that is embodied, and therefore does not depend upon a contextualist or oral means of transmission. The idea that Sunnah could originate among the consensus of Muslims themselves. The vague concept of Sunnah of the pious and the virtuous people. The so-called Sunnah that is accepted by all, as found in the writings of some of the early Mu'tazili scholars, or the concept of the well-preserved and well-known Sunnah. Al-Sunnah al-Ma'rufa, al-Mahfuza al-Ma'rufa, in early Hanafism. Moreover, in terms of the nature of the concept of Sunnah in formative Islam, evidence suggests that it would pertain to a general Islamic practice that was considered as simply righteous, or to a concept that is dynamic and ethico-behavioral in nature rather than textually fixed, hadith-dependent concept. Importantly, the concept of Sunnah during the formative period was constitutive of reason and reason-based opinion, and was understood and operated within a largely rationalist Islamic theology and ethics. Such an approach to Sunnah contrasts significantly with that of mainstream classical Islamic theology, legal theory, and ethics that are based on a non-rationalist or a different type of rationalist theology and ethics, to be more precise. But I do not have time to go into this distinction. So in conclusion of this section, we can safely argue that the classical concept of Sunnah that operates within the parameters of classical Islam's legal theory and theology, in terms of its sources, nature, and its scope, is qualitatively different when compared to how the concept was understood and conceptualized during the formative period of Islamic thought. Now, having set the scene, I would like to now talk more about the concept of Sunnah in progressive Muslim thought. In many ways, progressive Muslim scholarship regarding the concept of Sunnah has strong affinities and is a continuation of how the nature and the scope of the concept of Sunnah was conceptualized during the formative period of Islamic thought, including the idea of a conceptual and epistemological distinction between the concept of Sunnah and that of an authentic hadith, or the idea that Sunnah is a dynamic, ethico-behavioral set of norms, practices, and values, but not beliefs, that are not just linked directly to the persona of the Prophet Muhammad himself, but that other individuals or indeed groups that can be sources of Sunnah. To better understand how progressive Muslim thought approaches the concept of Sunnah, we need to first distinguish between different elements of Sunnah. As I have argued back in my first article on the nature and the scope of the concept of Sunnah, published in 2007, the concept of Sunnah, largely reflecting the nature of the Qur'an itself, can be categorized in its ethical, moral, legal, and ritual or praxis-based elements. And that it hermeneutically exists not only in an organic relationship with the Qur'an itself, but that the ultimate answer to the question as to what constitutes Sunnah depends on a host of other issues pertaining to the methodologies underpinning not only the classical Islamic hadith sciences, not only the ulum al-hadith, but also usul al-fiqh and ilm al-kalam. In other words, Islamic theology as well as Islamic legal theory. As since I mentioned earlier, progressive Muslims' manhaj is based on a more contextualist and rationalist approaches to Islamic theology and ethics that are based upon a particular understanding of the concept of God and divine ontology. All the elements of Sunnah in progressive Islam have to function within this broader epistemological, methodological, and ontological framework. Moreover, in progressive Muslim thought, all of the dimensions of Sunnah are either ethico-behavioral in nature or can be perpetuated in actu and therefore are embodied. As such, they do not depend on a textualist expression in order to be known, carried out, or transmitted. Furthermore, in progressive Muslim thought, no element of Sunnah pertains to Islamic systems of beliefs or aqidah, or individual Islamic beliefs like the shurut al-iman, as these all pertain to the realm of unseen, the ghaibiyat, and therefore cannot be embodied. As such, any hadith deemed authentic or not, according to the classical Islamic hadith sciences, that introduces any extra Quranic beliefs, such as the second coming of Jesus or Dajjal or punishment in the grave, are all rejected and are not considered as part of Sunnah. Moreover, the idea that Sunnah is an unrecited form of revelation as per classical Islamic interpretative tradition is also not accepted for the same reason. As I mentioned earlier, the ethical, moral, and legal elements of Sunnah, and therefore of the Qur'an, since progressive Islam considers both Qur'an and Sunnah to exist in an organic and symbiotic relationship hermeneutically, are based not only on a rationalist but also on a contextualist approach to both the Qur'an and Sunnah that recognizes the strong element of urf, or custom, that is found in the ethical, religious, and legal injunctions present in the Qur'an and Hadith. This recognition of the urfi nature of the Quranic ethical religious injunctions goes well beyond the confines of classical Islamic legal theory approaches to the concept of urf, which in actual fact, from the perspective of progressive Muslims' manhaj, conflates many of the urfi norms, values, and practices found in the Quran and the Hadith, either with Sunnah itself or with universalist elements of the Quran. Now, this aspect of classical Islam's approach to Quran-Sunnah-Urf relationship is perceptively noted by Mohsin Kadivar, one of the progressive Muslim scholars, who argues that in what he calls historical Islam, the sacred and timeless message of the divine revelation has been mixed with the custom at the time of its arrival, and that all the prophets that have entered into the traditional, and that all the problems that have entered into the traditional exegesis of Islam in the modern age relate to this customary part of the traditional Islam. Importantly, according to progressive Muslim thought, the urf-based injunctions that feature in the Quran and Hadith and were subsequently included in non-negotiable elements of classical Islamic law and ethics were considered reasonable and just by the contemporary community. In the words of Kadivar, and I quote, "Islam signed off on the pre-Islamic customs commandments as they existed, or with reforms in such a way that one might consider these commandments to have been revealed as marginalia to the common usage or urf of the age of revelation. Clearly, the common usage of that time was not scripture-bounded, tawqifi, imitational, ta'abudi, and sacred, qudsi. Otherwise, they would not be used by the reasonable people, the uqala. These commandments were legislated to achieve justice and advocate human communities' worldly interests, and I, end quote. However, this is not to imply that these urf-based legal injunctions and laws would continue to be considered reasonable and perceived as just forever. Indeed, Kadivar in this context makes the following assertion, and I quote, "On the other hand, one may not deny that human issues, particularly in the spheres of the social and human communities' common usage, or urf, have been severely transformed, and that many things which were considered just, moral, reasonable, and normal in centuries past would be considered oppressive, immoral, abnormal, and contrary to the way of reasonable people today." End quote. Similarly, another Iranian reformist-minded Muslim scholar, progressive-minded Muslim scholar, Hassan Yusuf Ashkavari, maintains that when it comes to the criterion of justice, the Quran recognizes urf of the time of its revelation as its primary criterion, but that these concepts of justice and their understanding are temporal and to some extent local. So according to progressive Muslim thought, all of the ethical legal injunctions found in the Quran and the Hadith, or those that have subsequently been canonized into Islamic law and jurisprudence, are considered as having been premised on customary considerations and are not meant to be applied literally regardless of context, and therefore are subject to change and evolution, and within the broader manhaj parameters associated with progressive Muslim thought, as I explained earlier. As a corollary, progressive Muslim thought recognizes that neither the Qur'an nor the Sunnah provide a systematic, ahistorical, and comprehensive system of universal ethics that can simply be retrieved or discovered, but that some principles of universalist ethics and morality can be deduced or derived based upon the Qur'an's and therefore Sunnah's comprehensive contextualization, and recognizing that Islamic law and ethics and its philosophy are essentially rationalist and purposive in nature. Similarly, Abu Zayd developed a systematic conceptual model of what he terms the intricately interwoven domains of Quranic meaning and its multidimensional worldview, which helps us to systematically distinguish its universal form elements from its temporal elements. For reasons that I talked about earlier on, these arguments and ideas that, although apply to the Qur'an, also would apply to the nature and the scope of the concept of Sunnah itself. Because Sunnah and the Qur'an, as I mentioned previously, function in a hermeneutically organic and symbiotic relationship. So the 5 domains of Quranic meaning, according to Abu Zayd, are first the cosmological. This domain encompasses the Quranic worldview of the cosmos, universe, nature, creation, recreation, the creator, death, and resurrection. The second element is at the level of divine-human relationships, that emphasizes both closeness and distinction in this relationship represented by the narratives in the Quran. The third dimension is about ethics and morality. The fourth is at the societal level, and at this level the Quran deals with specific practical issues such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, and this constitutes the domain of meanings connected to legal rulings, and therefore it's linked to the concept of Sunnah. For Abu Zayd, this is completely a domain of a domain of independent rational reflection or ijtihad, which is not to be limited to the analogical reason of classical Islam or the qiyas. Abu Zayd argues that the legal stipulations in the Quran originally addressed the 7th century milieu and the nascent Muslim community, which was specific to this context, whose totality must always be kept in mind. Abu Zayd laments that the classical usul al-fiqh, including its maqasid theory, did not do so because ijtihad had limited space in their overall interpretational schemes. Abu Zayd notes further that at this level, legal rulings are interwoven with ethics and insists that the meanings of these kinds of verses should be understood in the light of prevalent ethical common sense, ma'aruf, which in his view is an important element in Quranic ethics and is in accordance with the principles of benevolence or ihsan. At the final 5th level are the punishments or the hudud. This is the final domain that exists in the Quran, but it does not belong to the Quranic worldview proper, for it includes the category of legal rules as they existed before the Quran. The Quran merely borrowed them in order to protect society against certain crimes. Therefore, they are not universalist. Abu Zayd therefore argues that the socio-legal injunctions mentioned in the Quran merely reflect the 7th century civilizational reality the Quran confronted and ought not to be considered normative. Now, since in progressive Muslim thought, as I tried to emphasize earlier on, there is an organic hermeneutical relationship between the Quran and Sunnah, the same analysis with respect to the multidimensional worldview of the Quran would also apply to Sunnah itself. Moreover, when dealing with the question of canonical hadith corpus, as a source of Islamic ethics and laws, progressive Muslim scholars have used a number of mechanisms that are inclusive but go beyond those associated with classical Islamic hadith sciences when discerning what can legitimately constitute Sunnah as a normative source of Islamic ethics and laws. In this respect, we can point to the work of Barazangi, who makes a hermeneutical distinction between the process of authenticating hadith and an independent process of validating hadith in order to arrive at what she calls the new non-patriarchal concept or theology of Sunnah. We can also identify the approach of Faqihuddin Abdul Qadir, who uses contextualization associated with classical hadith sciences of ilm asbab al-wurud and applies the concept of maqasid al-sharia to hadith in order to arrive at normative Sunnah. But his approach to maqasid is very much contextualist and rationalist. So what are some of the major ethical and ethico-religious implications of this approach to the concept of Sunnah in progressive Islam? Well, the ethical, legal, and socio-cultural implications of this approach to Sunnah are indeed wide-ranging. I will mention just a few. For example, ethico-religious practices such as female genital cutting, so-called honor killings, and veiling that have some textual support, primarily in the form of hadith, and have been either justified under the umbrella of Sunnah or have been considered as acceptable or at least tolerable elements of Islamic law and ethics, or more broadly, norms associated with Muslim majority cultures, are from the perspective of progressive Muslim hermeneutics seen as expressions of the logic of patriarchal honor and are not seen as practices equated with or constituting Sunnah. Furthermore, the practice of stoning to death in the case of adultery is also rejected as being part of normative Sunnah, since this punishment is based on certain approaches to purely hadith-based evidence. Indeed, all other legal punishments found in Islamic criminal laws, the hudud, are considered as outdated on the premise that they were based on urfi considerations that the Qur'an and normative Sunnah did not introduce or view as normative, as I explained earlier by pointing to the work of Kadivar or Abu Zaid. The concept of Sunnah and progressive Muslim thought, therefore, has many important ethical and socio-cultural implications and can provide important solutions to many ethically ossified ethical and socio-cultural values, norms, and laws that currently exist in some Muslim majority religious and cultural contexts. This approach to Sunnah and progressive Muslim thought also provides an authentic, historically informed, faith-based alternative which can update the Islamic interpretive tradition ethically and epistemologically, bringing it on par with contemporary global and human rights era-inspired ethical, legal, and cultural sensibilities, which are considered part of Islam's truest ethical norms, values, and practices. So, in my presentation, I outlined the nature and the scope of the concept of Sunnah in progressive Muslim thought. I argue that unlike the hadith-based concept of Sunnah from classical Islam, the concept of Sunnah in progressive Islam has strong affinities with how the concept of Sunnah was understood during the formative period of Islamic thought. In this respect, I argued that the concept of Sunnah in progressive Islam operates within its broader contextualist and rationalist approaches to Islamic theology and ethics, and that it is a general ethico-behavioral and embodied concept that is not viewed as a source of Islamic beliefs, nor is it considered as a form of unrecited revelation. Although for hermeneutical purposes, it exists in an organic and symbiotic relationship with the Qur'an. I also briefly alluded to the approach progressive Muslim scholars use when dealing with the hadith in order to arrive at normative Sunnah. Finally, I identified several concrete implications of this approach to the concept of Sunnah in progressive Islam that does away with many norms, values, and practices that have been associated with the concept of Sunnah in classical Islamic law and ethics, such as those pertaining to Muslim family laws or those associated with Islamic criminal law. In this respect, I noted how The progressive Muslims' approach to normative Sunnah enables the Islamic interpretative tradition to shed its ethically and epistemologically outdated norms, values, and practices that have often been defended on the basis of a concept of Sunnah that operates within the hermeneutical confines of classical Islamic theology and Islamic legal theory. Now, there's a couple of slides here that I would like to show you that I have used in addition to those I provided at the very beginning of the lecture, for those who are interested.